All right, folks, here we go with the notes for Chapter 3, talking about the ethics of management. Now, let's first take a look at what we mean when we say ethics. What is ethics? Well, ethics derived from the word ethos is concerned with basic questions about what is right and what is wrong, and it involves the character and conduct of individuals and institutions. Basically, what we're talking about is how a society looks at what is morally right and wrong, and ethics reflects that point of view. Now, on an individual level, ethics provides one's own understanding of proper conduct based on principles and rules that one considers important. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about a system of values in which either a group of people or a society or an individual creates this mindset of the things that are proper and good versus those things which are not. And you can imagine that there's several different opinions on how we should formulate those sorts of ideas. There are many ways to study ethics. One approach employs empirical methods to describe the particular moral values of a group or society, that it creates some sort of a standard in that sort of way. Another area of study, known as normative ethics, is concerned with understanding which values are the most relevant to a society. So the difference there is that the standard is the standard versus determining what the standard should be for a certain time and a certain place and a certain people, trying to develop ethics in terms of the context around you. Ethics can also be examined in terms of organizations and the code of ethics that they adopt. Many groups will set up their own thoughts on what is the proper way to do things, to think about things, and they'll have that as a written document. And then finally, one may also study personal ethics, and those are the things that you hold within yourself in terms of what you think is right and wrong. So some ethical decision making in the media and the process that happens there. There's no universally accepted code of ethics in the media industries. Shocking, I'm sure. But basically what has happened is that there has been attempts over the past 150 years or so to create some sort of a standard. But by and large, even when one gets established, it tends to fall apart, or people don't stick to it in a fairly overwhelming sort of way. So basically, as far as someone saying, this is what we do, this is how we act, in our industry, even though it's been tried, it hasn't really happened overall. Wherever group or organizational ethics codes exist, conflicts may arise between the organization's approach and the individual's moral beliefs. We see this happen all the time in all sorts of different industries, where a particular company may make a certain point of view known, and it could clash with some of the philosophies of its employees, sometimes even with those that are within management, and it can create some interesting problems that have to be dealt with in one way or another. What management does, it attempts to balance the needs of the marketplace and the market itself in the ethical situations media organizations confront on a daily basis. So it's that sort of thing where, because you are dealing with an entity, and that entity many times in our business is going to be a corporation of some kind. We're not necessarily talking about a sole proprietor. the owner, if you will. But you're trying to incorporate the thoughts of this entity in and of itself, the corporation, and how it is going to act ethically, and work that within this ecosystem of those that work with it, within the industry in general. And a lot of times there has to be a little bit of give and take, either on the part of the employees, on the part of the corporation, or on both. And those things can get really messy. So these ideas of ethics in many companies and corporations wind up being these living, breathing, evolving sorts of things. That is another reason why many times there's no universal standard when it comes to how we do this as an industry. The 5 ethical duties of mass media employees. First off, duty to self. Media professionals need individual integrity and the strength to follow their conscience. Duty to the audience. When deciding on a particular course of action, what effect will it have on the audience? Well, and the audience is the population that gives the media their presence, their ability to function, because when consumers take in what they have, that means, ratings go up, and they're able to sell that audience to advertisers. So there's that sense of sometimes doing more what the audience wants and expects, more so than your own interests. Duty to employer or organization. Duty to the firm that it may outweigh individual duty in certain situations. And that one can be really hard for people that work in the industry sometimes to have to reconcile. Duty to professional colleagues. To what extent does duty to coworkers and even to competitors affect the decisions that you make? And then duty to society. Many issues call into question our duty to society. In news, individual rights to privacy and confidentiality often arise. And there's all sorts of different types of ethical situations that we deal with in terms of news and reporting and that sort of thing. Media content that contains scenes of sex and violence also directly concerns society. These tend to be a couple of the big hot topic issues that media companies have to deal with. They're not the only things, but they tend to be forefront when we talk about the ethical decisions that a media company may make. Ethical decisions have extended consequences. Managerial decisions go beyond immediate or first-level consequences. Decisions affect others throughout the organization and society. Very rarely does a decision that's made in our industry affect just one individual. And even if it does only direct one individual, you can imagine there's going to be a lot of people that's going to have an opinion on the decisions that are being made. Ethical decisions have many alternatives. Few decisions involve a simple yes or no. Managers must consider all options when making an ethical decision. So, a lot of times, the correct course of action may not necessarily be clear cut, because there's many alternatives, and there's often also mixed outcomes, I should say. Ethical decisions often produce both benefits and costs that managers may or may not foresee. So what may happen is that there may be more than one plausible way to approach something, and there's going to be different pros and cons as to how we deal with those things. Certain decisions may benefit a company financially or may hurt a company financially, but may create a stronger reputation in either the industry or in the eye of the public, based on decisions that are being made. And a lot of times those things have to be considered and weighed in terms to what is overall in the best interest of the company, what is in the best interest of society. Sometimes those things do not mesh well together, and one or the other may have to give. And the decisions on those sometimes are not just an absolute, of course, this is what we should or should not do. Most ethical decisions have uncertain consequences. Rarely are managerial decisions free of risk or doubt with clear-cut alternatives. Usually, managers cannot foretell the full consequences of an ethical decision. That's another hard issue of it, is that even if we do our best to weigh the pros and the cons of everything, sometimes the answer is we simply don't know. And we may wind up shooting in the dark to figure out the course of action that we need to take in a situation. And ethical decisions have personal implications. Ethical decisions are intertwined with the values, beliefs, and other personal qualities of managers, and in most cases, managers face both personal benefits and costs in the ethical choices that they make. So, can you separate yourself from the situation and perhaps make a decision that may be good for many other entities while also creating a disadvantage for yourself? And, well, should you? Those are things that we have to consider in these questions. So, ethical norms come into play, and these provide a means of making informed decisions. So, when we talk about whenever there is a certain standard, those things many times are going to be instrumental in helping us to choose what is the correct course of action to take in a situation. Now, just because it's an ethical norm doesn't necessarily mean it is a universal standard that should always be applied in every situation in a certain area. Because, again, these questions many times are complex. There's a lot of different sides to a particular issue, and trying to weigh the pros and cons of everything based on the decision maker's philosophy, based on the company's philosophy, based on society standards and those sorts of things. All of these things come into play, but in many cases there are certain ethical norms that we try to at least keep in mind. Very few people, for example, would say that it is good to ever kill somebody. So if a decision was being made that a decision may result in the loss of life, that would definitely sway one's decision in a situation where possibly there could be lethal circumstances. Kind of a morbid example to bring up, but one that tends to be fairly common sense. But even then, there are situations there where, might there be a time where you can't necessarily consider that as the only consideration in a situation. Let's talk about norms used in moral decision making. One can define ethical norms as a set of theories derived from the study of ethics and ethical principles. Ethical norms are useful because they provide a philosophical foundation from which to analyze ethical situations and to make intellectually defensible judgments. We all tend to have certain thoughts about what is right and what is wrong. Those standards come to us from different areas of life, whether it is some sort of a philosophical thought. For many people, religion comes into play here. Traditions of an area that you live in or from a certain culture. A lot of times these things help to shape what we think about what certain things are right and wrong. And so those things become norms for us. Let's talk about some different ethical norms. First one we're going to talk about is the golden mean. This comes to us from Aristotle. The golden mean stresses moderation as opposed to extremes or excess. Aristotle believed that an individual could achieve strong moral character, but he or she would necessarily face difficult choices. And by adopting a middle position that's not extreme in position A or extreme in position B, one could avoid both excess and deficiency. So when we look at the golden mean, it is trying to take that idea of the middle road. Is it possible to do some sort of a compromise, which sometimes is looked at as a dirty word in some circles, in some situations, but is there a way to appease everybody at least a little bit? Or is there a way to look for what would be of benefit to as many people as possible, or things like that? And moderation, being in the middle, not going extreme one way or another, is one way to take a look at that. Some journalistic applications of the golden mean include the principles of balance and fairness in reporting, taking the idea of a particular issue and looking at it from all sides and all points of view, and maintaining objectivity in covering and reporting the news instead of having a strong bias towards one position or another. Another ethical norm is the Judeo-Christian ethic, and these ideas come from the Old and New Testaments, illustrate respect and dignity for all people based on a universal love for God. In making ethical decisions based on this norm, one would consider how the decisions would impact others. And some of the applications here would be things like avoiding the degradation of certain populations, such as females and minorities. That idea that everybody has worth, and we need to value people in general and persons in particular as they are all children of God. Now, there's a lot of other principles that go into that in terms of how people interpret Scripture and what that means for us as we live our lives and how we interact with others. Obviously, this is not a religion class, so we're not going to dive deep into those sorts of things, because there's as many ways to interpret Scripture as almost seemingly as much as there are people on earth. And that's, of course, assuming that that Scriptures are held in any sort of authoritative context to certain populations of people. So there's a lot of different angles from which you can go from the Judeo-Christian ethic. There tends to be a certain core of things that people will hold on to based on interpretations of the Bible or of the Torah for the Jewish tradition. And we could group other religions in here as well to a certain extent. Islam, and then even those that don't necessarily subscribe to the God of the Bible as the source of things. Other religions also have some of these standards that go into place that help us determine how we live our lives, and many of those also focusing on the value of people. So there's some things there that come to us from these largely rather old traditions that have been with humanity for a long, long time, and help to shape the way that we think about right and wrong. The categorical imperative. This comes to us from Immanuel Kant. Ethical decisions are derived from a sense of moral duty based on principles underlying individual actions. principles we can apply comfortably to all situations will lead us to the right decision, and the outcome of the decision is largely irrelevant compared to holding the standard of the principle. So the idea that there is going to be a right course of action for just about everything, and regardless of what happens as a result of that action, well, the course of action is the course of action is the course of action. And usually it's going to be based on some sort of code that needs to be upheld regardless of the situation. Okay, next one, utilitarianism. This comes to us from John Stuart Mill. When faced with moral decisions, one must consider which actions will result in the most happiness for the greatest number of people. This maxim is often referred to as the greatest good approach to decision making, and this is more concerned with the consequences of an ethical decision. What will happen as a result of us making a particular choice, as opposed with the process of the decision making. So this tries to weigh the outcomes of different things and trying to assess what the best outcome is going to be when making an ethical decision. A good example might be if someone is to steal. Let's say a single mother that has no money steals food from a grocery store. But the result is that she is going to feed several children with that food that would otherwise starve. Some might argue, well, in order for the children to not starve and they can continue to live and be healthy, in that case, stealing is not as bad as the fact that children are eating. There's that thought that people have, that in that case, the stealing is not as bad of a wrong in that particular case. Egalitarianism from John Rawls. Everyone must be treated equally and fairly when forming ethical judgments. One of the concepts here is the idea of the veil of ignorance. And what this is, by wearing a veil when forming a decision, an individual can eliminate possible biases or discrimination and therefore treat all persons in an equal manner. So it's trying to make the same decision on a particular situation in front of you, regardless of who it is that is being involved or impacted by whatever situation that you may be making, or not necessarily knowing the extent to which certain things are happening. That you're basically trying to make judgment based on the face value and just the particular details in a general sort of way of what is happening. Some of the applications of this would include reporting news from all sides of an issue and not showing preference for a particular worker or a particular advertiser. So the thoughts of those that want to create equal opportunity for all, regardless of who they are, where they come from, what the point of view is, those sorts of things. That has egalitarianism that runs through those kinds of ideas. Relativism. This comes to us from John Dewey and Bertrand Russell. What is best for one is not necessarily what is best for another, even under similar situations. So a little bit different than what we just talked about. Each individual decides what is best from his or her viewpoint and does not judge others' decisions. In other words, what's okay for me may not be okay for you, and that's okay. The relativist position has given rise to the study of situational ethics, which examines ethical decisions found in individual situations. And some of the ways that we may use this sort of philosophy include looking at issues of controversial or obscene content versus audience temperament. And it's trying to take a more subjective look at what sort of actions, what sort of things may be appropriate in what certain situations. Having different types of content based on what an audience might accept would definitely play into this sort of role. Some people have no problems at all with what we have traditionally called adult content, for example, so long as we protect children from seeing adult content because children are not adults and that sort of thing. The social responsibility theory, coming to us from the Hutchins Commission, says that journalists and other practitioners generally make responsible decisions that serve society. Though individuals in the media cannot correctly determine the exact impact of their decisions, they make them with good intentions. So it's that idea that as people, as a society as a whole, kind of that thought that we're inherently good and we're going to do our best to do good. And this presupposes that we have a way of thinking about ourselves and a way of thinking as it relates to society, that we're going to do what is the best for all of us as a whole. And specifically when it comes to the media, we're making decisions that is not going to alienate people, at least in an intentional sort of way, and try to show ourselves in the best face we possibly can to as many people and groups as we possibly can. Now, arguments can be made as to how well media do this, and certain media companies, if they do this and practice this or not. That is something that I'm sure will be part of debate in times that we get together to talk about these things. Two broad categories of philosophical thought. The first is the idea of deontological ethics. These are concerned with the process of making decisions based on established principles. So going back to that idea that the standard is the standard is the standard. Because these theories are not concerned with outcomes, followers of those theories are often referred to as non-consequentialists. It doesn't matter what happens as a result of the action because the action needs to follow a certain standard. These theories examine both the intent and the motives of actions, and therefore we have to look at that sort of thing in terms of the actual innate process of what's happening when we make a moral decision. Then there's teleological ethics. These are concerned with the actions or consequences of decisions more so than the actual intent beforehand. Ethically correct decisions are those that produce the best consequences. So we are trying our best to benefit as many people as we can, or to not benefit as few as we can when we look at ethics from a teleological standpoint. Now, that was a lot to go through so far, so this might be a good point for us to take a break, and we will finish up the chapter with the second video, part B. I'll see you over there.